23 August 1942, Stalingrad, Soviet Union. The sky above the Volga River turned black at 6 p.m., not from storm clouds, but from the shadow of 600 German bombers, Heinkel He-111s, Junkers Ju-88s, and Stukas, descending like iron locusts over the city of Stalingrad. Within minutes, the first wave of incendiary bombs ignited wooden houses, fuel depots, and grain silos along the riverbank. The firestorm was so intense that pilots flying at 4,000 feet could feel the heat rising through their cockpits, the thermal updrafts shaking their aircraft as they banked away from the inferno below. By nightfall, 40,000 civilians were dead. The Volga itself seemed to burn as oil slicks caught fire on the water's surface, creating rivers of flame that stretched for kilometers. Mothers clutched their children in basements that became ovens, the oxygen sucked out by the firestorm above. Soviet anti-aircraft gunners fired blindly into the smoke, their barrels glowing red-hot, their ammunition dwindling as wave after wave of German aircraft passed overhead. And in that inferno, a battle began that would decide the fate of the Second World War, not through grand strategy or brilliant maneuver, but through something far more primal: the refusal to surrender a single brick, a single room, a single meter of scorched earth. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War. Where are you watching from, and could you have endured what these soldiers faced in the months to come? Stalingrad was never supposed to matter this much. In the summer of 1942, Adolf Hitler's war machine was at its apex. From the frozen forests of Norway to the deserts of North Africa, the swastika flew over a conquered continent. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union launched 1 year earlier in June 1941, had driven Stalin's forces back over 1,000 miles in the largest military operation in human history. 3 million Soviet soldiers were dead or captured in the first 6 months alone. Entire armies had been encircled and destroyed in massive Kesselschlacht operations, cauldron battles, where German panzers would break through Soviet lines, circle behind them, and trap hundreds of thousands of men in pockets that collapsed within days. The Soviet Union had lost territory the size of Western Europe. By August 1942, Hitler's southern offensive, codenamed Case Blue, was racing toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, the black gold that would fuel the Reich's war machine for years to come. Stalingrad, a sprawling industrial city stretched along the western bank of the Volga River, was merely an objective of convenience. Capture it, cut the river, secure the flank, and push south to Baku. Simple, clinical, efficient. But Hitler's obsession with names changed everything. Stalingrad bore the name of his greatest ideological enemy, Joseph Stalin, the man who ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist. To Hitler, the city became a symbol more valuable than any strategic objective. To Stalin, it became a fortress that could not fall, a line drawn in ash and blood that represented the survival of the Soviet state itself. And so two dictators, each driven by pride and ideology rather than military logic, funneled hundreds of thousands of men into a meat grinder that neither could escape. Personal vendetta disguised as military necessity. Ego dressed up as strategy. By mid-August, General Friedrich Paulus and his German Sixth Army, one of the most powerful and experienced formations in the Wehrmacht, blooded in the campaigns of Poland, France, and the Eastern Front, had reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. They expected to take the city in days, perhaps a week at most. The Luftwaffe had already turned much of it into rubble through relentless bombing. Soviet resistance appeared disorganized, desperate, on the verge of collapse. Paulus had 330,000 men under his command, 500 tanks including Panzer IIIs and IVs, 7,000 artillery pieces ranging from light field guns to heavy 150 howitzers, and complete air superiority. The 4th Luftwaffe Air Fleet operated from nearby airfields with impunity, bombing Soviet positions at will. Across the Volga, Soviet General Vasily Chuikov had a battered 62nd Army, barely 54,000 soldiers, many of them raw recruits who had never fired a rifle in combat, and a single order from Stalin himself that left no room for interpretation. Not one step back. Retreat was treason. Surrender was death. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a brawl in the ruins of civilization, a descent into a kind of warfare that belonged more to the trenches of World War I than the mechanized campaigns of 1942. The Germans entered Stalingrad on 13 September 1942, expecting to fight an army in the streets. Instead, they found a labyrinth designed by chaos itself. The Luftwaffe's bombing campaign throughout August had transformed the city into a surreal landscape of shatter. Concrete, twisted steel girders, and mountains of rubble that blocked entire streets and avenues. Buildings leaned at impossible angles, their facades ripped away to expose rooms like dollhouses, furniture still visible on floors that now hung over empty air. Staircases led to nowhere, ending abruptly in midair. Basements opened into sewers that connected to factories half a mile away, creating an underground network that Soviet soldiers would exploit with deadly efficiency. The Soviets, retreating across the Volga in apparent disarray just days earlier, had done something unexpected, something that took the Germans completely by surprise. They turned the destruction into a weapon. General Vasily Chuikov, a short, stocky man of 42 with a volcanic temper, a genius for improvisation, and a reputation for leading from the front, understood immediately that Stalingrad's ruins neutralized every German advantage. Tanks couldn't maneuver through streets choked with rubble and collapsed buildings. Stukas couldn't dive-bomb targets hidden under collapsed roofs and in basement warrens. Artillery was as likely to hit your own advancing infantry as the enemy defenders when the front lines were separated by a single wall. The German doctrine of combined arms warfare, the coordination of tanks, aircraft, and infantry that had smashed Poland, France, and most of the Soviet Union, simply didn't work in an environment where you couldn't see 50 meters in any direction. So Chuikov gave his soldiers a new doctrine, simple and brutal: hug the Germans. Get so close to the enemy that their bombers and artillery couldn't be used without killing their own troops. Turn every building into a fortress. Fight for every floor, every room, every staircase, every closet. Make the Germans pay in blood for every meter. Force them into the kind of close-quarters combat where Soviet numerical superiority and willingness to absorb casualties would gradually grind them down. The Soviet 13th Guards Rifle Division, 10,000 men commanded by General Alexander Rodimtsev, a hero of the Soviet Union who had fought in the Spanish Civil War, crossed the Volga on the night of 14 September under a sky lit by tracer fire, searchlights, and burning buildings. German machine guns raked the boats and barges from the western shore, the water erupting in geysers around the overloaded craft. Men fell into the black water, dragged down by their equipment, rifles, ammunition pouches, grenades, drowning before they could reach the shore. Those who made it to the western bank scrambled up clay embankments under mortar fire and sprinted into the skeletal remains of the city center, following guides who led them through the rubble in the darkness. By dawn, they were fighting inside the Mamiev Kurgan, a 102-meter-high hill that dominated the city and provided observation over the entire battlefield. Whoever controlled the Kurgan controlled Stalingrad. It would change hands 8 times in the next 2 weeks, sometimes multiple times in a single day. Soldiers later said the hill was so soaked with blood that grass wouldn't grow there for years after the war. The soil itself was mixed with bone fragments and shrapnel. In spring, when the snow melted, the ground was black. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats, because that's what soldiers became in the ruins: rats fighting over scraps of concrete, scurrying through holes in walls, living in cellars, emerging at night to kill, and then disappearing again into the darkness. To understand the true brutality of Stalingrad, you must understand the scale at which men fought and died, the distances at which they killed each other. In a conventional battle on the Eastern Front, Soldiers engaged at ranges of 100, 200, even 500 meters. Artillery fired from positions kilometers behind the front line. Tanks dueled at distances where you could barely see the enemy vehicle. In Stalingrad, the average engagement distance was 10 meters, sometimes less. German and Soviet soldiers threw grenades at each other from opposite ends of a hallway. They fought with shovels, knives, bayonets, and chunks of concrete when ammunition ran out. They strangled each other in the darkness of basements. They fought for single rooms for days, neither side able to advance or retreat, firing through holes in walls, tossing grenades through doorways, deafened by the constant noise of explosions in confined spaces. A Soviet sergeant named Yakov Pavlov and 24 men held a 4-story apartment building, later named Pavlov's house, for 58 days against constant German assault. The building sat on a key intersection near the Volga, and its capture would have given the Germans a direct line of fire to the river crossing points. Pavlov's men fortified the basement with sandbags and rubble, knocked holes through interior walls to create firing lanes, so they could move through the building without exposing themselves in hallways, and planted mines in the stairwells connected to tripwires. They positioned machine guns in windows on all 4 sides, creating overlapping fields of fire that turned the approaches to the building into a killing ground. German infantry attacked the building daily, sometimes multiple times per day. Stukas bombed it repeatedly, blowing holes in the roof and upper floors. Panzers rolled up to point-blank range and fired directly into the ground floor, collapsing walls and filling rooms with dust and debris. But Pavlov's men survived by moving through the building like ghosts, never sleeping in the same room twice, rationing bullets to 3 rounds per man per day, and launching night raids across no man's land to steal German weapons, food, and ammunition from dead soldiers. By October, a Soviet officer calculated that Pavlov's house had killed more Germans than the entire city of Paris during the 1940 invasion of France. 24 men had inflicted more casualties than a capital city. That single fact tells you everything about the mathematics of Stalingrad. The fighting consumed the great factories along the Volga, the Red October steel factory, the Barricadi gun factory, and the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory. These were massive industrial complexes that stretched for kilometers, each one a city within the city. The Red October factory alone covered over 2 square kilometers and employed 10,000 workers before the war. Inside these factories, Soviet workers welded armor plates onto tractors and drove them directly into battle when the tank supply ran out. Women operated 85 anti-aircraft guns mounted on factory roofs, firing at dive bombers until the roofs collapsed beneath them from bomb damage. German soldiers advanced through assembly lines still littered with half-built tanks and artillery pieces, fighting room to room through machine shops and foundries where blast furnaces still glowed. Overhead cranes hung motionless, frozen in place by damage. At night, Soviet engineers used the factory's internal rail systems, narrow-gauge tracks that connected different sections, to move supplies and reinforcements through tunnels the Germans didn't know existed, couldn't see, and couldn't bomb. One German officer, a captain in the 24th Panzer Division, wrote in his diary on 26 September, "We have fought for 2 weeks for a single house. The front is a corridor between burnt-out rooms. From story to story, faces black with sweat, we bombard each other with grenades in the middle of explosions, clouds of dust and smoke, heaps of mortar and fragments of furniture. We attack stairs and corridors with hand grenades and fire from automatic weapons at point-blank range. From the upper stories we shoot down through cellar windows. Stalingrad is no longer a town. By day it is an enormous cloud of burning, blinding smoke. It is a vast furnace lit by the reflection of flames. And when night arrives, one of those scorching, howling, bleeding nights, the dogs plunge into the Volga and swim desperately to gain the other bank. The nights of Stalingrad are a terror for them. Animals flee this hell. The hardest stones cannot bear it for long. Only men endure." Chuikov's command post was a bunker carved into the clay embankment of the Volga, less than 800 meters from the front line, so close that he could hear individual rifle shots and the screams of wounded men. German shells landed so close that dirt rained from the ceiling during staff meetings, and several times the entrance was temporarily buried by near misses. Chuikov chain-smoked cigarettes and drank vodka while studying maps by candlelight and oil lamps, knowing that if the Germans broke through, his headquarters would be overrun in minutes, and there would be no escape except into the river. Every night he stood on the embankment and watched boats cross the Volga carrying reinforcements, young soldiers, many of them teenagers conscripted from villages in Siberia and Central Asia, who had never seen combat and were given 3 days of training before being shipped west. They landed under artillery fire and flare light, climbed the muddy embankment, and were sent directly into the meat grinder with rifles that many of them barely knew how to operate. The average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier arriving in Stalingrad in October 1942 was 24 hours. Some units lost 80% of their strength within 48 hours of crossing the river. But Chuikov had one advantage the Germans could not match: the Volga River itself. As long as the Soviets controlled the eastern bank, they could pour men, ammunition, and supplies into the city every night under cover of darkness. The Germans could bomb the river, shell it with artillery, even freeze it partially in winter when temperatures dropped to -30°C. But they couldn't cross it, couldn't cut it, couldn't stop the flow of reinforcements. Paulus's Sixth Army was slowly being bled white in a siege they couldn't finish, fighting an enemy that regenerated every night like a mythological hydra. The Soviets also pioneered new tactics for urban warfare that would influence military doctrine for decades. They created storm groups, small teams of 8–10 men armed with submachine guns, grenades, and satchel charges, trained to clear buildings room by room. Each storm group had a specific composition: a squad leader, riflemen for covering fire, submachine gunners for close combat, grenadiers with pouches full of hand grenades, a flamethrower operator, and sappers with explosives. They would blast holes through walls rather than use doors and hallways where the Germans expected them. They moved through buildings vertically, fighting floor by floor, using grenades to clear rooms ahead of them. They operated primarily at night, when German air superiority was neutralized and confusion reigned in the darkness. By early November, the Germans controlled approximately 90% of Stalingrad. The Soviets held a strip of land along the Volga no more than a few hundred meters deep in most places, sometimes as narrow as 50 meters. German soldiers could see the river. They could watch Soviet boats crossing at night. They could almost touch it. Paulus requested one final push to break Soviet resistance and finally capture the entire city. Hitler agreed enthusiastically, seeing this as the moment of final victory. On 11th November, the Sixth Army launched its last major offensive. German infantry, supported by remaining panzers and combat engineers equipped with flamethrowers and explosive charges, smashed into the Soviet positions at the Barricadi factory and the Red October plant. For 3 days and nights, men fought in assembly halls, through storage rooms, across conveyor belts frozen in place by damage and cold. The Soviets retreated meter by meter, blowing up sections of the factory behind them, collapsing tunnels, destroying what they couldn't hold. On 18th November, German troops reached the Volga at one point near the Red October factory, driving a wedge to the river and cutting the Soviet 62nd Army into 2 isolated pockets. Paulus radioed Hitler triumphantly, "Stalingrad is ours. Resistance has collapsed." But 200 kilometers to the north and south of the city, in the frozen steppes where snow was already falling, something else was happening. Something the Germans had not seen, had not anticipated, had not prepared for. Something that would turn victory into catastrophe in less than a week. Operation Uranus. While Paulus and his Sixth Army bled themselves white in the ruins of Stalingrad, fighting for individual buildings and city blocks. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov, Stalin's most capable commander and the architect of Moscow's defense in 1941, had been quietly assembling one of the largest military operations of the war. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers, 13,500 artillery pieces, 900 tanks including the excellent T-34 medium tanks, and 1,100 aircraft were positioned in two massive fronts north and south of the city. The buildup had taken months and was conducted with extraordinary secrecy. Units moved only at night. Radio silence was strictly enforced. Dummy positions were created to deceive German reconnaissance. The plan was brutally simple in concept, but required perfect timing and coordination. Bypass Stalingrad entirely, punch through the weak Romanian and Italian armies protecting the German flanks, satellite forces that lacked German equipment and motivation, and encircle Paulus's entire army in a giant pincer movement that would close 60 kilometers west of the city, trapping the Sixth Army and all its support units in a pocket with no way out. The Germans knew the Soviets were massing troops. Aerial reconnaissance had spotted concentrations. Intelligence reports came in from Romanian units describing Soviet buildup across from their positions. Paulus himself requested permission to withdraw from Stalingrad and shorten his dangerously extended supply lines, which stretched back over 300 kilometers through hostile territory. Hitler refused categorically. "The Sixth Army will hold Stalingrad," he ordered. "There will be no withdrawal. The city is of the utmost strategic and symbolic importance. It must not fall back into enemy hands." At 7:30 a.m. on 19 November, the Northern Front erupted in fire. Soviet artillery fired over 3,500 shells per minute along an 80-kilometer front, a density of fire not seen since the great battles of World War I. Romanian positions disintegrated under the barrage. Trenches collapsed. Communications were severed. Command posts were obliterated. When the barrage lifted after 80 minutes, Soviet T-34 tanks poured through the gaps, followed by cavalry units and mechanized infantry in trucks. The Romanians, poorly equipped with obsolete anti-tank weapons that couldn't penetrate T-armor, broke and ran. By nightfall, Soviet armored columns had advanced 50 kilometers into the German rear, capturing supply dumps and our running headquarters. Chaos spread through the German command structure. The next day, 20th November, the southern pincer attacked with equal violence. Again, Romanian defenses collapsed within hours. Soviet tank columns raced westward through snow and gathering darkness, their commanders pushing forward without pause, without consolidation, gambling everything on speed and surprise. German commanders realized too late what was happening. Frantic reports flooded into Paulus's headquarters. Enemy armor breakthrough. Romanian Third Army disintegrating. Soviet columns advancing west. On 22 November, Soviet forces from the northern and southern pincers linked up at the town of Kalach, 60 kilometers west of Stalingrad, near a bridge over the Don River. The trap was closed. The steel jaws had snapped shut. Paulus's Sixth Army, 250,000 men, 100 tanks, 1,800 artillery pieces, and over 10,000 vehicles, was surrounded in a pocket measuring roughly 50 kilometers from east to west and 40 kilometers north to south. An entire German army, one of the most powerful formations in the Wehrmacht, was cut off deep in Soviet territory with winter approaching. Hitler faced a decision that would determine the fate of the Sixth Army and potentially the entire Eastern Front. He had two options, both difficult. First option, authorize Paulus to break out immediately, abandoning Stalingrad and all the equipment that couldn't be moved quickly, but saving the army and its irreplaceable veteran soldiers. This would mean admitting defeat, abandoning the city that bore Stalin's name, and retreating west to establish a new defensive line. It would be a propaganda disaster and a strategic setback, but the army would survive. Second option, order Paulus to hold the pocket and attempt to resupply the trapped forces by air using the Luftwaffe, until a relief force could be assembled and fight its way through to break the encirclement. This would maintain the German position on the Volga and preserve the symbolic importance of holding Stalingrad, but it was extremely risky. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall and commander of the Luftwaffe, promised Hitler that his aircraft could deliver 500 tons of supplies daily to the encircled Sixth Army through an air bridge, enough to keep the troops fed, armed, and operational until relief arrived. Göring was desperate to prove the Luftwaffe's value after failures in the Battle of Britain, and his air force's inability to stop Soviet production. He assured Hitler the airlift was completely feasible based on similar, but much smaller operations earlier in the war. It was a lie, or at best a catastrophic miscalculation. Göring had no concept of the logistics involved, the distances, the weather conditions, or the Soviet air defenses that would have to be overcome. The Luftwaffe never delivered more than 100 tons per day on average to the Stalingrad pocket. On some days, no aircraft got through at all due to weather. Paulus's army needed a minimum of 800 tons of supplies daily just to survive: food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, winter clothing, fodder for horses. The German army still relied heavily on horse-drawn transport. The mathematics of survival simply didn't add up. Hitler chose the second option. The Sixth Army will hold Stalingrad, he ordered. It will be supplied by air until relieved. There will be no breakout. The army will form a hedgehog defense and hold until the situation is restored. By early December, German soldiers inside the pocket were on quarter rations. Each man received 200 grams of bread per day, less than half a standard loaf, and watery soup made from horse meat. They burned furniture torn from houses to stay warm as temperatures dropped to -20 Celsius. Horses, essential for moving supplies and artillery, were slaughtered for meat, which meant the army's already limited mobility decreased further. Wounded men froze to death in field hospitals that lacked fuel for heating, medicine for treatment, and transport aircraft to evacuate them. Frostbite casualties began to outnumber combat casualties. Men's feet froze in their boots. Fingers turned black and had to be amputated without anesthesia. General Erich von Manstein, Germany's most skilled field commander, was given command of a newly formed Army Group Don and ordered to launch a relief operation. Operation Winter Storm began on 12 December with the 4th Panzer Army, reinforced with units pulled from other sectors. The panzers smashed through initial Soviet defenses and advanced rapidly, covering nearly 50 kilometers in the first few days. By 19th December, Manstein's spearhead had reached a point just 48 kilometers from the southern edge of the Stalingrad pocket. Paulus could hear the sound of Manstein's artillery in the distance. A rhythmic thunder that told the trapped soldiers help was tantalizingly close. Manstein radioed Paulus, "Begin breakout toward my position. You must fight your way out. I can advance." NCE no further. But Hitler refused to authorize a breakout. "The Sixth Army will hold its position," he repeated, unwilling to abandon Stalingrad for reasons that were now purely symbolic. The strategic rationale had long since evaporated. This was about Hitler's ego and his unwillingness to admit failure. Manstein's attack stalled as Soviet reinforcements arrived and counterattacked. On 23 December, Soviet forces launched Operation Little Saturn, a massive offensive against the Italian Eighth Army northwest of the pocket, threatening to encircle Manstein's relief force itself. Manstein had no choice but to withdraw or risk losing his entire army group. The panzers turned around and retreated. The window of salvation closed. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, German soldiers watched the artillery flashes recede into the distance and realized they had been abandoned. The Soviet noose tightened methodically through December and January. The Luftwaffe airfields supplying the pocket were overrun one by one as Soviet forces advanced. The surviving German aircraft had to fly longer distances from bases further west, which reduced payload capacity and increased vulnerability to Soviet fighters. German pilots flew increasingly desperate missions in Ju-52 transport aircraft, slow, lumbering three-engine planes that were easy targets for Soviet anti-aircraft fire. They landed on improvised airstrips carved into the frozen steppe inside the pocket, often under direct artillery fire. Many planes were shot down on approach. Others crashed in blizzards that reduced visibility to zero. The ones that made it delivered ammunition and morphine, the two things most desperately needed, but took off packed with wounded men, stacked like cargo with no medical care, many dying during the flight back. The Luftwaffe lost over 500 aircraft and 1,000 aircrew trying to supply the Stalingrad pocket, losses it could never replace. For comparison, Germany lost 1,200 aircraft in the entire Battle of Britain. The Stalingrad airlift destroyed the Luftwaffe's transport arm and consumed fighter and bomber units needed elsewhere. On 8 January 1943, the Soviets offered Paulus formal surrender terms delivered by emissaries under a flag of truce, immediate cessation of hostilities, guaranteed life and medical treatment for all soldiers, retention of personal possessions and decorations, eventual repatriation to Germany after the war. The terms were remarkably generous by Eastern Front standards, where quarter was rarely given or asked. Paulus immediately requested permission from Hitler to begin negotiations. Hitler's reply came within hours. Surrender is forbidden. The Sixth Army will hold to the last man and make an unforgettable contribution to the greatest struggle in German history. The final Soviet offensive began on 10 January after the surrender offer was rejected. Operation Ring involved over 7,000 artillery pieces bombarding the shrinking German perimeter. The bombardment was so intense that it could be heard 100 kilometers away. Soviet infantry advanced through deep snow, taking back the factories, the ruins, the train stations, the apartment blocks that German soldiers had fought for months to capture. The pocket was systematically crushed, divided into smaller segments, each one isolated and destroyed in turn. Wounded Germans without ammunition raised their hands in surrender. Soviet soldiers, remembering the slaughter of the previous summer, the burned villages, the murdered prisoners, the brutality of the German advance in 1941 and 1942, sometimes shot them anyway. Mercy was in short supply on both sides. By 26 January, the pocket had been split in two. The southern group was trapped near the city center. The northern group was isolated near the tractor factory. They could no longer support each other. Ammunition was almost gone. Food had run out days earlier. Soldiers ate leather belts and boot soles boiled in water. Medical supplies were exhausted. Thousands of wounded lay in basements with no treatment, no heat, no hope. By 31 January, Paulus's headquarters was surrounded in the basement of the Univermag department store in central Stalingrad, a large building that had once sold consumer goods and now served as the command post for a dying army. Soviet tanks parked outside the entrance, their guns trained on the doors. At 6:00 a.m. on 31 January, a Soviet lieutenant colonel walked into the basement and demanded Paulus's surrender. Paulus, gaunt and exhausted, his uniform hanging loose on his shrunken frame, signed the surrender document. Hours earlier, in a cynical gesture, Hitler had promoted him to field marshal, the youngest in German history. The message was clear. No German field marshal had ever surrendered in the field. Hitler expected Paulus to commit suicide rather than face the humiliation of capture. He didn't. Paulus chose life in captivity over a meaningless death. On 2 February 1943, the last German resistance in Stalingrad ended when the northern pocket surrendered. Of the 250,000 men trapped in the encirclement, 91,000 were taken prisoner, starving, frostbitten, broken men who could barely walk. Only 6,000 would survive Soviet captivity and return to Germany after the war, most of them not until the mid-1950s. The rest died of typhus, dysentery, starvation, and the brutal conditions of Soviet prison camps. The Soviets had lost over 1.1 million soldiers killed, wounded, or captured in the Stalingrad campaign when you counted both the defensive battle in the city and the encirclement operations. The Germans and their Axis allies lost approximately 850,000 men. Entire divisions ceased to exist. The Sixth Army, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, was obliterated. 22 German divisions were destroyed. The Romanian armies that had protected the flanks were shattered. Stalingrad was not just a military defeat for Germany. It was a psychological earthquake that reverberated through the entire Reich and the occupied territories. For the first time since the invasion of Poland in September 1939, a German army had been utterly destroyed, not just defeated in battle, but annihilated as a fighting force. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility, the belief that German soldiers and German doctrine were superior to any enemy, died in the rubble along with 250,000 men. Across occupied Europe, resistance movements took heart from the news. In France, Yugoslavia, Poland, and elsewhere, partisan activity increased. If the Germans could be beaten at Stalingrad, they could be beaten everywhere. In Berlin, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels declared 3 days of national mourning. Theaters, cinemas, and restaurants closed. Flags flew at half-mast. Wagner's funeral music played on the radio. But behind closed doors, Nazi officials understood that the war had fundamentally changed. The initiative had passed to the Soviets. Germany was now fighting a defensive war, trying to hold what it had conquered rather than expanding the Reich further. The question was no longer whether Germany would win, but whether it could avoid losing. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became the ultimate symbol of survival and sacrifice, a victory that proved the Red Army could not only absorb catastrophic losses but recover, adapt, and win. The city was rebuilt after the war, rising from the ruins over decades. Monuments rose to commemorate the battle. The towering statue of Mother Russia on Mamiev Kurgan, standing 85 meters tall with her sword raised toward the west, commemorating the 1.1 million Soviet soldiers who died defending the city. The grain elevator, deliberately left in ruins, stands as a memorial to the ferocity of the fighting. The city itself was renamed Volgograd in 1961 during de-Stalinization, but to this day, veterans and historians still refer to the battle as Stalingrad. But what made Stalingrad different from other battles? Why did the Soviets win when they had lost so many other battles, when they had been defeated again and again during 1941 and early 1942? They won because they made the destruction their ally, transforming the Luftwaffe's bombing into an advantage rather than a disadvantage. The ruins negated German technological superiority and forced the kind of primitive, close-quarters combat where Soviet willingness to accept casualties could gradually grind down the Germans. They won because Chuikov understood that in the ruins, courage and determination mattered more than technology and firepower, that a man with a rifle in a basement could stop a tank, that the psychology of urban warfare favored the defender who refused to retreat. They won because Soviet soldiers, fighting with their backs literally to the Volga River with no possibility of escape, found a kind of desperate courage that wouldn't break no matter how many bombs fell or how many men died. They won because the Soviet Union's industrial capacity, factories relocated east of the Urals during 1941, producing tanks and guns beyond German reach, could replace losses of men, tanks, and ammunition faster than Germany could inflict them. They won because Stalin, for all his brutality and strategic errors, understood that Stalingrad could not fall without catastrophic political and psychological consequences, and he committed whatever resources were necessary to hold it. And they won because Hitler, obsessed with a city that bore Stalin's name, refused to see Stalingrad for what it had become: a trap, a killing ground, a strategic dead end that consumed irreplaceable forces for diminishing returns. His refusal to allow Paulus to break out in November when it was still possible, doomed the Sixth Army. His insistence that the city be held for symbolic reasons rather than abandoned for strategic ones showed the limitations of ideological warfare divorced from military reality. The Germans entered Stalingrad expecting to conquer a city in days. They left in chains 6 months later, having learned a lesson that empires have learned since Rome: that a city, once it decides not to fall, once its defenders commit to fighting for every brick and every grave, can become a graveyard for any army foolish enough to enter its ruins. But in another corner of Europe, an equally desperate battle was raging. Join us next time as we uncover the story of the Siege of Leningrad, where an entire city endured 872 days of starvation, bombardment, and horror that killed over 1 million civilians and refused to surrender.